Putting It Together, the podcast that goes through the entire body of work of Stephen Sondheim, show by show and song by song. My name is Kyle Marshall, your self-described Sondheim expert. And I'm here this month as a little bit of a bonus episode, a Sondheim-adjacent episode that we're recording here today. Don't know how long this one is going to go for necessarily, but I thought that it would be interesting, or at least fun for me, to discuss some of the one recent musical that has debuted at the box office, as well as a very small film I was able to see here a couple months ago at the local International Film Festival, which I know also got a small release, and that hopefully you'll be able to check out soon. The first, of course, being Wicked for Good, the second one being the latest film from Richard Linklater called Blue Moon. I also do want to discuss at some point Kiss of the Spider Woman, but I just have not had any time to fit that into my schedule here recently. So these are the two that we're going to talk about here today. Let's start with the one that I'm sure most people are curious to know about or curious to discuss. And I should say here right at the very beginning that if you have your own comments and thoughts and want to send those in, you definitely can. You can send that to puttingittogetherpodcast@gmail.com. I'm not going to go into the plot synopsis of Wicked for Good. I feel like anyone who is going to see that film kind of understands what it's all about. It is a riff on The Wizard of Oz, the novel, which in itself is based, meaning I guess if we want to go all the way back, this is an adaptation of the musical Wicked, which was in itself an adaptation of the novel Wicked, which was in itself a rendition of an alternate history of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, the book by L. Frank Baum. And everybody and their mother has an opinion on Wicked. If you've been able to see it on Broadway, where it's been running for, I believe, 22 years now at this point, there has been debates and arguments ever since it debuted about what works and what doesn't work in that musical. People that are fanatic about it, people that despise it with every fiber of their being, and everything in between those two opinions. I will go on record as saying that while I will go on record as saying that I am not obsessed with the musical Wicked, I will unmask myself and say that I have enjoyed very much the original Broadway cast album on more than one occasion. Not every song hits, although very few musicals is it where every song hits, but as a collection of emotional power ballads, of small, more intimate moments, I think that there's some great stuff there. And this is going to basically show my hand here a little bit as far as what my opinions on the movie are, but I do think that this is a show that really succeeds because of how well constructed Act 1 is of the musical. I think if you just take that as its own thing, it's nearly unassailable as far as just a plotting perspective goes. There is clear stakes, there is emotional moments, there is great songs, there is all this stuff that is laid out to you in such a great way that there is no wonder that if you break for intermission at that show, so many people are going to be very enthusiastic about it because there is some juice there. It even has what I think a lot of great musicals have, which is a point of view. It is very much erring on the side of, being anti-totalitarian, being against governments overreaching by regulating what is and what is not humanity. There's all this stuff that's wrapped up into a fantastical bow, but it is there underneath the surface. I think what draws people through, of course, is this enemies to friends storyline of Glinda and Elphaba, but also kind of like a bubbling love story that's going on there. So there's all this stuff for so many different audiences that, again, there's no wonder in my mind why this has become such a cultural phenomenon. Now, when it came to the movie, we've talked about it here on this show, of course, before in passing more than anything else. But this idea of splitting up the stage show into two films. And everyone had their chance to make jokes and look down their nose and be like, isn't this a blatant cash grab? Which it is. We should not overstate that fact. But I would say that if there was any reason to make an argument to break Wicked into two separate films, and have each half by themselves be longer than what the entire stage show is if you go and see it, than it is to quote unquote fix the problems with Act 2. Because, at least from my perspective, when you go back in after intermission, it then tries to cram what should be like a 3 hours of plot into the span of like 45 minutes. You are rushing through that second act. There is majority of this stuff that is happening off stage. You are just glossing over like major things that are happening. And I think maybe you could even overlook some of that if the music was on the same level as Act 1. There's a couple that you might be able to go to bat for, but as far as like a series of bangers in a row, Act 2 just doesn't have that. So, if we're going to make this into 2 movies, then let's expand upon the stuff that we don't actually see in the stage show, lean into that a bit more, expand those scenes you don't really see, write a couple more songs, win your Oscar for Best Original Song, that sort of thing, and call it a day. Would it surprise you of how shocked I was then when I go and see Wicked for Good, and in fact, none of those issues have really been addressed. And I should also say here at the very beginning, just to get that out there too, is that I was a fan of the first film as it was. Yes, I have these huge nitpicks. They're not even nitpicks, but like major criticisms on the way the film looked. I think it's much too drab and flat for a big fantastical world. But as far as like a star-making vehicle for both Cynthia Erivo and Ariana Grande, both of them shine in that film, proving that they can, carry a multi-billion-dollar film. Some of the set pieces were really inventive. It was just a fun time at the theater. There was hootin' and there was hollerin' in the screening that I went to see when I went to see the first one, for sure. It's just a complete and utter slam dunk of a crowd pleaser. So that's where I was coming from. So coming into Wicked for Good, I have a bit of heightened expectations here then at the very least. Curious how they're going to fix all these problems. My perceived problems, I guess, of Act 2. And then am pretty shocked at the fact that what they then decided to do is not actually show any of that stuff that happens off screen. Instead, really expanding scenes that already exist. And then also invent a couple other scenes that don't advance the plot in any conceivable way. They just re-communicate things that we already know about these characters, which I do think is why, in part, the 2 added songs into this film, in my mind, are not great. One I think is actively bad. One is just fine. But I think they mostly don't work is because they're not communicating anything we don't already know about these characters. They're not discovering really anything new. They're not communicating anything that hasn't been done in either a book scene or a previous song in the show. So they just seem superfluous to it. Also, one of them is basically just a character sitting and singing at the camera, which also never is all that visually interesting, I wouldn't say. So instead, we're left with this thing that becomes a paradox where it is both, like, simultaneously feels like it is treading water for most of its 2.5 hour long runtime, but also rushing through all of these plot points. I saw this video come across my feed with the criticism being, from this person's point of view, that there is no plot in Wicked for Good. And I fundamentally disagree. I think it's the exact opposite issue. There's too much plot. They're trying to wrap up 5 different plot lines. There's all this stuff that is like gearing towards the ending that they're essentially handcuffed to, because this does have to align with The Wizard of Oz, again, the book, and tangentially the movie too. And so you must get to that endpoint, this predetermined endpoint, except things are happening in this like unknowable amount of time between certain events. And so it feels like, is this happening simultaneously or before? Or why is this character pretending not to know who the Wicked Witch is if they did the entire time? Like, that doesn't actually fundamentally make sense. And so I think the whole thing, with even just like the barest of scrutiny, falls in on itself. And as you can see, or be able to probably hear from my reaction here, it's just like such a deflation. I think that's what a lot of people have been feeling, not just critics, but also other audience members, of just coming in here and being like, oh, this is going to be this huge, there was so much goodwill coming from that first film that we know that this is going to have this great climactic ending where we're going to see this all come together. And I don't think that really happens. I think the artistic choice here, which is, I would say, true to an extent in the stage show as well, of having Act 1 basically be Elphaba and then Act 2 be more about Glinda, does kind of fall flat here, because again, Glinda, until like the last 30 minutes or so of the movie, it isn't really driving the plot at all. So even though she is the center of attention, she is not actually what is making the plot threads continue on. And so I think that there is this kind of fight between what the text is giving you versus what the filmmakers wanted it to do with the text. And I just don't think it ever really comes together in an enjoyable way, let's put it that way, or something that fulfills you, I guess. Satisfying. That's the word I was looking for. It doesn't come together in a satisfying way. I don't think this is a total failure on every level. Maybe I've been, I don't know, grande pilled or something like that. As someone who came into these films not really caring about her pop music at all, 0%, listened to a few songs in my life of hers and was like, I don't ever need to listen to this again. Have seen her do some little comedy things in videos that have been shared around. And it's like, okay, well, that's cute and that's, charming. But I think in these two films kind of shows up that she does have a really phenomenal understanding of comedic timing. Maybe just for this character in particular, I guess time will tell. But I think she has phenomenal comic timing. She can really sing. She has a beautiful soprano voice. I think that was what was the most surprising to me out of this entire thing, because I was convinced she couldn't actually sing all that well. So I was a little dubious about whether she was going to be able to pull this off. So I think that she's able to uplift this movie to a certain extent. When she's on screen, I'm interested. Cynthia Erivo, again, is a great singer and a great performer, so she's able to hold her own. I just think that this is a fundamental catastrophic misunderstanding of how to adapt this second act. And who knows, maybe there's just a lot of stuff behind the scenes that prevented them from doing what I outlined before, that they couldn't expand upon stuff that was not already in the stage show. I don't know. I actually don't know that information, and maybe that is what it was. And so they just had to do what was in the stage show as best they could. But as theater fans have told you, Act 2 has always been considered the weakest of Wicked. So it's too bad that they couldn't have really analyzed that and said, let's smooth some of this out, make some of this a little bit more obvious about what is happening and what the time frame actually is. And I'll harp on this to my dying day. It's just so awkward to have things basically be communicated to the audience of well, that happened, but we're never actually shown that information to have happened. So regardless, this is just it's a kind of a confounding mess in many, many ways, which is too bad. So 5 stars out of 10. I don't know. I have no idea what I would rate it. It was a disappointment. Let's put it that way. Okay, so the other film I wanted to talk about, this is the one, I'll again show my hand here at the beginning, is the one that I would definitely seek out and give a watch to. This is a film called Blue Moon, directed by Richard Linklater. I'm going to just grab here quickly who the writer is of this film. So, written by Robert Kaplow. Probably Kaplow, but it looks better if it says Kaplow. Robert Kaplow. And this is a investigation into specifically Loren's Hart and the dissolution of his partnership, his creative partnership with Richard Rodgers. Now, there's a few things I'm going to say up here up front. First of all, this is absolutely, or it feels absolutely like a play that's been adapted to film. And I mean that as a compliment. I actually love those types of movies, so that is actually not a criticism on my part. I love that feel of ooh, I can really see how this would work on stage sort of thing. So long monologues, a lot of interesting movement around a very confined space sort of thing. So I was all in it for that. And also, I do realize that I believe this entire event that it is portraying is essentially completely made up. I don't think it actually even happened sort of like this. So they're doing a lot of creative license in this, essentially making a bit of historical fiction using real people that actually existed. The example or comparison I would make, not really for tone or anything like that, or even thematically what it's looking at, but just as that idea of taking real people to dig into a thematic theme. Oof, talk about a hat on a hat. It's Amadeus. It feels very similar to Amadeus, where that is not at all what that relationship was like in real life. Mozart and Salieri were not enemies, but it makes a really interesting character piece with these two characters, these two real-life people, to examine the idea of talent being God-given or talent that you have to attain. And how does that interact when you throw two people together, where one really has to fight for it and one it just comes naturally to? That's an Amadeus. In this film, it honestly is like watching a breakup happen in real time. It's no secret that in real life, Lorenz Hart was a gay man. They do reference that in this film as well, even though he is trying to sort of hit on this female through the entire thing. Although even that feels a bit performative on his part. You kind of have to see it to understand what I'm talking about. What I think is a beautiful exploration here, though, is that creative partnership. This is a guy, Lorenz Hart I'm talking about, who is a supreme alcoholic, who had an enormous talent for writing lyrics and writing beautiful poetry, but who could not get his personal affairs in order, which is why Richard Rodgers moved over to Oscar Hammerstein to form their partnership, and would become the biggest hit on Broadway for the next decade and a bit. And Lorenz Hart is not dealing with that very, very well. He really wants to reform the partnership, do a different show, and Richard Rodgers is kind of telling him, unless you can prove to me that you've changed, then this is not something that I'm interested in doing. So as just a bit of a setup, this is happening supposedly on the opening night of Oklahoma, and across the street at Sardi's, there's Lorenz Hart sitting at the bar, saying at first that I just want to order a drink to look at it, but I'm not going to actually drink. And then he launches into talking to the guy playing the piano, to the bartender, to E.B. White, who's also in this in Sardi's, writing some stuff. And then, of course, the party kind of spills over from the theater into Sardi's. There's some interactions that he has with Richard Rodgers, with Oscar Hammerstein, with a very young Stephen Sondheim, who I clocked immediately as they came into the restaurant, because it's oh, that is absolutely Oscar Hammerstein, and he's leading in front of him a small child, precocious child. I'm very certain that is a young Sondheim then in this case, and it is, and he has actually some dialogue which I won't spoil in this review, but it's a very Sondheim pithy remark that he does make. But it's not really about Sondheim. This is really about Lorenz Hart truly talking about love and yearning and really burying his soul. And I was so emotionally invested throughout this entire thing. I think that Ethan Hawke gives a beautiful performance through this. I would be shocked actually if he doesn't get at least an Oscar nomination. I don't think he'll win, but I do think he deserves to at least be nominated. And then the substitute being what's never outright stated is yes, this is a creative partnership, and that is definitely how Richard Rodgers looks at this, as a creative partnership. But I also think that there is a bit of, I guess I'll just preface this by saying, spoiler alert, kind of, for this film. So I guess skip ahead 20 seconds if you don't want to hear the next sentence out of my mouth. But while this is definitely a creative partnership crumbling, I do think that Lorenz Hart is seeing this also as a romantic relationship ending as well. Not that there was anything consummated between the two of them, but I think that there was this emotional connection that he has with Richard Rodgers, that he feels the need for a romantic partnership in his life. That's what this is. I think why I find this so soul-crushingly resonant is that this is a man who was renowned for his love songs, or at least that's in part what he's renowned for, is for writing about love and beautifully about love, who never received love in his life. So there is this kind of disconnect and this, again, yearning and sadness that permeates this, because this is a man who concerns himself with that emotion for his entire career and who never actually got to experience it in his life. And that is what the conflict is here the entire night, is him realizing and consistently being rebuffed and being turned down and being told, no, not like that. I don't like you in that way. And him retreating back into himself and like, don't I deserve this? Should there not be someone out there that I can reciprocate this with, where my feelings that are bubbling up inside of me that can be let go? And unfortunately, of course, he died very, very young, like in his 40s. So it has that extra bit of resonance, because this is ending badly. But yeah, for me, I need to rewatch it. I really want to sit down and rewatch it again, because I just thought it was such a beautiful exploration into those ideas. And I will say too, if you're into Broadway lore and Broadway history, there are so many Easter eggs and deep cuts they throw in, just kind of as passing dialogue. It's nothing ever really winking to the camera, except I might argue one or two moments are kind of there for a wink, wink, get it type of thing. But most of the time, it feels very natural for someone to say something or make an allusion to something or reference something that you don't absolutely need to know the history of to enjoy the film. But I do think it adds a little extra flavor if you do know the history of Broadway when they're discussing it. Filled with a bunch of other Broadway people here too, like Bobby Cannavale is the bartender. Andrew Scott is Richard Rogers, and then there's a handful of other people that show up throughout it as well. But this is one of those things that if you are, one, a Broadway fan, I think you'll get a lot out of this. Two, if you're a Sondheim fan, which you probably are if you're listening to this podcast, then you get to that little bit of a cameo from him partway through, which is a little bit of an extra thrill. But I just think it's just a well-constructed film, and something that I'm going to be coming back to probably again in the future. It's so interesting that I wonder if this has ever happened before. I'm sure it has, where a director adapts a story that focuses on a creator that they're going to adapt one of their works later on. Because, of course, Richard Linklater is adapting Merrily We Roll Along as we speak. He's been filming it over the last few years, and I think has 7 or 8 more years of filming left to go on that project before he releases it. And here he is adapting a story that features Sondheim way before that film will ever see the light of day. So just a kind of a curio more than anything else. Okay, well, those are the films I've been watching. This has been kind of your bonus episode here for the month. We'd love to know if you've seen either of these films. Please write in, like I said, if you have any feedback or questions, and we will talk together very, very soon. As I mentioned in the last update episode, I am beginning work on the Saturday night season, so expect that here in the next month or two. But until then, have a great day. Get mad at Wicked, I suppose. I guess that's the message here for this month.